The Happiness Quest.
Imagine.
He can hear us. Hi. Actually, squeak when we go together too. Hello, and thank you for joining us today on the Happiness Quest. My name is Jess Dutel from the Center for Business and Community Partnerships at Plymouth State University and the PEMI Youth Center, thanks to our Service Learning Partnership.
And I am Dr. Maria Sanders, a professor of philosophy at Plymouth State University and CEO of Philosophy for Life. And today's topic is happiness a choice? So to what extent do we choose happiness? To what extent does it choose us? I brought the basic breakdown that most researchers agree upon. And this is a pie chart that outlines the percentage of our hardwiring towards happiness versus the part that's really our choice. Mm-hmm. So in this particular pie chart, what is in green is about 50% of our predisposition towards happiness is hardwired into our genetics. Mm-hmm. So we have some people who are just naturally prone to being happy, others takes a little more work to get there. About 10% is driven by external circumstances, and then the remaining 40% is driven by our individual choices. So it might help if we have a visual on this.
So I brought some blocks today so that we could create a visual based on that research information.
So if we think of each block as 10%?
Yes.
Okay, so let's put our genetics, so what's hardwired, off on this side. So we would have 50%. Try to stop knocking it over. This is the choice. And then in the middle, external circumstances.
Yeah.
So the stuff that happens to us.
What we experience externally, the things that
Exactly.
happen that we can't control, the circumstantial experiences that we have.
With both of these are really internal, because this
Right.
one's hardwired into our minds, but this one, even though we're making choices, it's really being driven by what's in our minds as
Yeah.
well. So let's start by talking about our largest stack, since it's the largest one there, the hardwiring. I don't know how it is for you. I know you have 3 children. I have 4. And they're hardwired differently, each of my
Absolutely.
kids. And I tend to think of, when I'm discussing happiness and the hardwiring of happiness, the genetic side of it, 2 of my children in particular, because they are really almost at polar opposites in this hardwiring. One is, if I can borrow from Winnie the Pooh, what I would label as an Eeyore. That he has a tendency to see the glass half empty.
Half empty.
He has a tendency to see potential problems or issues even when something positive happens. Whereas my daughter is more of a Tigger, and she sees the glass as half full. And if, I always use the example, if the house was on fire, my Eeyore would say, the house is on fire, we need to get out of the house, things are going wrong. Well, my Tigger would be more likely to say, well, it's kind of cozy warm now. I see the positive side.
Cool.
Yes, especially in the dead of winter.
And we need both.
And that's so important, that both are essential and valuable, because it's really that balance between the 2 types of hardwiring where we get the best of all worlds.
So we're not putting value on either
No.
those predisposed to be Tigger or Eeyore. In fact, we had a scenario that the circumstance that unfolded over the weekend was that one of our bathroom faucets broke. And we have some suspicions of how that came to be based on some of the actions unfolding where our kids will jump up on the counter and kind of, they're a little tough on the faucet, but we're not going to go down that road right now. So what happened was we found out about this circumstance, and we had one child who said, oh, this is the worst thing possible to ever happen to us. In fact, Mama, we need to buy a new house. Because obviously our house is no longer perfect.
It's
right?
broken.
It's broken. And then to the other end of that spectrum, our Tigger, who said, are you kidding? It's okay. We still have water. We have 2 other bathrooms. We don't even need that faucet. you can use that rest area, you can come out and you can go in the kitchen and wash your hands, no problem. So that glass half full. And so it's interesting based on the fact that they've grown up in the same environment with the same parents, but yet they see the world through different vantage points, and two of them wear the rosy goggles, and the other has this experience of everything being just dreadful. But we need that perspective too.
Well, we need it, and I think the important thing when we're talking about happiness to remember is, even though there's a different lens in the hardwiring, when it comes to happiness, it doesn't really matter how I'm hardwired, what the actual result will be in how I feel or how I view my life, if I'm satisfied or content with my life. We can't ignore the other two parts to the formula, because really when we think about the hardwiring or the genetics, it's our starting point. It's kind of like point zero, and that's just where we're going to start from. But when we look at the things, like in your example, what's happening in the house, the external circumstances, that's going to have a direct impact on how we react to that hardwiring. And then of course 40% of it, so nearly half, is coming back to exactly how I personally react to it, what I do with it, how I respond to those things that are happening. Your choice.
How you respond.
So I think it's really important that as we add these other two columns up, they balance out with the hardwiring. So our individual hardwiring really shouldn't drive whether we are happy or not. It's just simply the springboard on kind of what sets it into motion, I guess is the way to think about it.
And our resting point, right? So I've heard you speak before about the external circumstances that could play out in your life, and the research study on the winning the lottery circumstance or the unfortunate event of becoming paralyzed, right? And those participants showed that you come down to your predisposition or your resting point.
Right, and that is, I guess, if we move over here to the external circumstances, like you're mentioning, the research has been very consistent in showing it doesn't matter if it's something really positive or something horrible and really negative. For most individuals, there's some exceptions, as you would imagine, but for most individuals, it takes approximately 6 months. That for 6 months, it's going to have a direct impact on how they're feeling and probably even how they're thinking about their life in a more holistic sense. But as you're mentioning, after 6 months, we're going back to that predisposition. So, for example, I'll use the cases you brought up, the winning the lottery versus becoming maybe like a quadriplegic. The person who wins the lottery and was hardwired more towards that Eeyore setting, within 6 months is going to be thinking about the negative side of winning the lottery, whether that's tax consequences or maybe it's the loss of friends or the different connections that are happening that they're not finding positive.
Or the new type of friends who
new type of friends,
remember
new way
you
of living.
from second grade all of a sudden, and they want in on your winnings.
Right, and we hear in many cases where they win the lottery and they end up worse off or more unhappy than they were before they won it. Some of that is what's happening here where they're returning to their predisposition. Not entirely, but that's some of it. Whereas if you take the example of the Tigger who suddenly is in, let's say, some horrible, unfortunate accident, ends up paralyzed, they're the ones 6 months into it now that are raising funds for others or leading maybe some sort of specialized Olympic Games. They return back to that positive outlook and lens, and it's just a new point of beginning in their life because of that external circumstance that happens, but it doesn't change their predisposition, the hardwiring.
And then there's this 40%.
Yes, and that's really what we want to focus on today. So I'm going to deconstruct these so they're not sitting in front of you for the whole show. But it is the last 40% that we're really focused on, and that's the choice. And before we dive into what kind of choices directly impact our self-reported levels of happiness according to the research, I guess as a philosopher, I'd like to start by thinking about what it even means to say we have a choice. You know, this is something that for many people we probably just take for granted. We don't really think about it. Where others may take for granted the opposite conclusion, that we don't have any choices. You know, it's all really just happening to us. And why I think this is an important reflection, there is research that shows individuals that believe in free will or believe that the human being has choices and is making choices, they tend to report a higher level of happiness than those that feel like the world is predetermined. And we really aren't making choices, we may just feel like we're making choices.
So feeling that you have control over what is happening to you, what you're experiencing throughout your life.
Rather than it all just happening to you.
Like so you're a victim of circumstances.
Exactly. So if we think about freedom and free will and what it means to be free, there's an interesting thought experiment by a famous modern philosopher, John Locke. If you've heard of him, you're probably more familiar with him maybe tied to politics. He's the philosopher that we drew a lot of the concepts in our Bill of Rights from. You know, thinking of like natural rights, and Thomas Jefferson read him thoroughly. But he also has, in philosophy, what we call epistemology, which is a philosophy of the mind and how the mind operates. And here's his thought experiment, is imagine while you were asleep, you were carried into a room, locked in that room, so you wake up and you're locked into this room, but you're in the room with someone, a long-lost friend that you haven't seen for years, and you've been longing to spend time with. So you're locked in a room that you have no desire to leave. Are you free?
And that's interesting. So as I heard you talking about this scenario, my mind immediately went to my best friend growing up, because she lives on the West Coast and I only see her maybe once a year. So I thought, ooh, if I woke up all of a sudden in this room with Julie, how exciting that would be. And are you free? Because I don't necessarily have a reason to leave. At some point I do, right? At some point I have to go on with my life. But is freedom then in your mind? Or is it a physical
and
attribute?
Is there a difference between being like actually free in reality versus the perception?
And it is your
of freedom?
perception. That's what I was leaning towards, right? It's your perception. In fact, interestingly enough, we use choice theory, which was made popular by William Glasser at the PEMU Center. So we really want to have many choices for our middle school and high school students, because what we find is that they feel in many ways, in some circumstances, that they don't have choices, that their life is really determined for them. And we want to transform that perspective, and we want to help them understand that, oh, you didn't get a suspension because something happened to you. You got a suspension based on the choices that you made.
So
and you
consequences from those actions.
Yeah, you have control over that. So what are your choices? And how can we help you understand them better so that you recognize the power that you have to move through the world and have the results that you want unfold, right? So interestingly enough, I feel like it is about your perception, that you have an experience and you either perceive it as this is something happening to me and all of a sudden I don't feel free, or I do have this choice, that I want to engage in this conversation with my long-lost friend, Julie. But at what point do I want to get out?
Right, until you change your mind and you want out of the room. Locke himself will draw a distinction between, in the case of his thought experiment of it, the individual voluntarily staying because they're not desiring to leave, and being free. He will actually say he's not free because he's locked in. So there's this actual absolute definition to the concept he's applying. But because he doesn't desire to leave, he does feel that the individual's voluntarily staying. So he draws a distinction between what it means to be voluntary versus what it means to be free. But I think in the context of choice, you nailed it. It's important to remember, especially within this realm of happiness, if we're on a quest for happiness, we don't want to ignore that we have some very kind of well-put, stagnant things in our life that are happening to us. And I think about like your children at the youth center. I mean, they are in some life situations where they don't have control. You know, things are happening to them, and that is something that needs to be acknowledged, that we don't necessarily have the freedom to do whatever we want to do. But that doesn't equate to I have no freedom.
Or I'm powerless.
Exactly.
Right? So in that scenario, they can't control the choices their parents make. But we want them to understand, but you're not powerless. You do have a choice in how you react. And so that's not something, for many of them, that's not something they've ever thought about before. That when this suspension's handed down to me, or my parents ground me, or whatever the scenario is that they are experiencing that feels very negative, well, what did I do to contribute to where I am now? And then what can I do now to transform my experience going forward?
Well, and it's so valuable. I mean, we're talking about it in the scenario of youth, but this doesn't change. You know, as adults, I mean, put it in a context of employment.
Yeah.
You know, you have maybe one employee who feels that things are happening to them, and if they're not getting promotions or if they're ending up with negative consequences, it's because of the stuff happening to them, versus an employee that might be in the cubicle next to them or one office over, and they feel that empowerment, that they're the ones making choices and the consequences are really the result of their own choices, even though both of them have the same external circumstances that are controlled around them.
Exactly.
You know, so that's life. You know, it does not change. I think about the case of a deer, and I can remember this back when I was pretty young, probably about 9 or 10. One of my teachers had shared with me and I don't remember the exact distance anymore, but the distance that an average deer will travel if it doesn't run out of food and it's not pushed, like say it's not being hunted or so forth, that they really don't have this desire to travel long distances. The reason many deer do is because they're looking for food or for safety reasons. And so the scenario that was painted in this class was, imagine you had, I'll take one of my little blocks here, imagine you have a deer, this is our deer, and the deer in its entire life is not going to go outside of a set perimeter. I come beyond that perimeter and build a fence. So it's kind of like taking your entire life, everywhere you're going to travel, and then build a fence beyond those limits. You will probably, in fact, theoretically, you'd never even know the fence was there because it's beyond anywhere you're going to travel in your entire life. Is that deer free? Are we free in that scenario? Because we definitely have those kind of parameters. Even now, if I decide that I truly want to go live on Saturn, I can't do that. Maybe in the future, maybe things will be changing on these planets and the atmosphere and so forth. But right now, that's not a choice I have. But it's also not a choice I desire to have. So there's an interesting phenomenon, if we go back to the deer example. What happens when the deer becomes aware of the fence versus when we're not really aware of those parameters that may be right in front of us?
Well, that goes back to your example. I have a sense of freedom until I go to get out and I find that the door is locked, right? And then all of a sudden, that sense or that perception of freedom is gone.
And even stronger, if you aren't aware you're locked in the room, you have no desire to leave the room. You still have no desire to leave the room, but now you become aware. Maybe over a loudspeaker, someone says, "Oh, by the way, you're locked in." You know, does it still continue in the same mindset? Well, I don't care because I don't want to leave. I'm fine. Or do I suddenly click over, which tends to be human nature?
Oh, for sure.
Well, if I'm locked in, now I want out.
Yes.
Like we shift our focus and how, in a way, we perceive the situation we're in, even though nothing has changed except our awareness in our mind. So our mental state is the only thing that has changed.
And how we react to whatever circumstance we find ourselves in.
And that's what I think is valuable when it comes to happiness. It's we do throughout life tend to have these announcements made where you realize perhaps you didn't have the freedoms you thought you had. You realize or become aware that the door's locked and I didn't realize it was locked. We're getting towards the end of a school year, an academic year here, and I think of the juniors and in particular the seniors in high school as they're selecting their college choices. Some of them are going to have that awareness where they get into a college, it's their dream college, and they can't afford it. So suddenly the door is locked and they didn't realize it was locked because maybe they saw the barriers as things that they could overcome, but now at the end of the game, it's not something they can overcome. They're not going to be able to go. How do we respond to that? and do we plan ideally on the front end to have other options so that suddenly it's not that I'm not going to college, I may not be able to go to that particular college. And in hindsight, years later, looking back on it, you may realize that's all for the best.
Right.
So it's this interesting thing of discovering,
Yeah.
those things that are
Right.
restricting us, I guess, in the moment in
Yeah.
life.
And sometimes we feel like it's restricting our choices, but when we reframe it, when we look at it, like you said, from another angle, is this 5 years, 10 years down the road going to work out for the better?
Right.
And just having that trust that it will. But that's hard sometimes in the moment.
Well, and one thing that may help is to, again, think in our worldview, to think of how the world operates in a less fixed format. I mean, we talk about the individual feeling free and having a perception of freedom, but also in how we view, I guess in a way we can think of the universe and the living creatures in it, so humans, animals, plants, and so forth. That quite often when we're feeling restricted, like we don't have the freedom of choice, it's because we're viewing in a very narrow sense as if I have one or maybe two options and this is my life path and I already have it all figured out, this is what I'm supposed to do. When in reality, if you think about it, that's kind of presumptuous.
Yes.
For how little we know about the world and about our life and what we can actually become, that there are all these opportunities that sometimes we need that one door that we've been focused on to realize that that's locked, that's not the one I should be going, because there are 8 other windows or doors that I'm ignoring because I'm so focused on this one door in front of me. So it does come down to kind of this perspective, this lens that we see the world
So
through.
that's interesting to me. I've been thinking a lot lately about overthinking and the need to...
As a philosopher, I do tend to do that from time to time. So.
Well, and as you know, I'm working on my EDD now at Plymouth State, and so I'm immersed in this pattern of analyzing and thinking and working through concepts, and so I find myself overthinking in periods of time. And this need to really monitor my thoughts and making sure that they're healthy, what's running through my mind, and not being overly self-critical. I mean, we've talked about this in previous shows as well, but I think it's important because you make a choice. The thoughts you think, you choose, right?
And the first step is being aware
And
that you're
being aware
even
that
doing
you're
some of that
doing
negative
that.
self-talk.
Yeah. And so sometimes when we get into this pattern of overthinking, it pulls us down these mental paths that, aren't necessarily all that healthy. And recognizing that, having that awareness, and then pulling back and thinking more intentionally, is this helping me in this moment? What choice can I make?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and we think of the difference between living a life that is, in a large extent, living for the future, where there's a lot of planning, goal setting, which again are not only important things, they're actually essential if we think of happiness within the eudaimonic sense of it, which we've mentioned before on the show, but this idea of a full and flourishing life. We have to be taking the future into account. We have to be thinking and planning for the future.
Sure.
But there is a danger with doing that we can actually miss the present because we're so focused on what's coming down the pike. I always find it interesting when I talk to individuals that are like in their 70s or 80s. I remember my grandfather was 98 and still saving for the future. And I'm like, okay, are you saving like to pass it down? Or like, what's the plan here? And you don't want to be dark about it, but at the same time, we can have our whole life pass us by and miss it if we're not careful.
And also, if we're so in tune to the outcomes we think we want, or we're so focused on that door that ends up being locked, and then what? And then where are we going? And that feels like a crisis, right? But
well, it can feel like you wasted all this time, when in reality there is no potential to waste time. It's all life.
And we're learning and growing as we go.
Well, and that's the point, isn't it? Right. It's not the end goal, that life really is the goal of it all. So, are you familiar with Carl Honore, the Canadian journalist? He wrote the book In Praise of Slow. And I always find it comical because what motivated him to write his book that was focused on being in the present, that whatever you're doing right now, really be present with it, is he really enjoyed reading bedtime stories to his son. And he had a very busy corporate type life,
Sure.
And so I could relate to this. But he really he looked forward to that time in the evening where he could read a bedtime story to his son as he's putting him to bed. And he caught himself the one night reading a story, and I don't remember offhand which story it was, that he was skipping pages. And I believe his son even called him out on it. It's like, that's not how that worked last time. It's like, so he's giving the condensed version of the story. But it was a moment for him of realization.
Yeah.
He sat there and he's like, okay, this is what I look forward to. This is what I really enjoy doing. And I'm rushing through it. And he was rushing through it because he wanted to go check some work emails, get basically a leg up on the next day at work. But he was rushing through the part of his life that he really enjoyed. And so he ended up really sitting down thinking about living in the present, and he writes this book in praise of slow. So slow down and live in the present. The irony in it, it became so popular that he now travels around the world talking about the book, and he's as busy as ever. And so
it's time to read.
It's a difficult balance to strike. And as we've discussed before in the show, there is research that shows if we're not busy enough, our level of happiness, how we self-report it, drops. Yet if we're too busy, stress kicks in, and again, we're unhappy. So it does seem to come back to this balance, finding that point of balance. But it's so important to really live and be present in what we're doing at the time,
taking it
in that moment.
Yeah. Because how often do we drive from home to work and then forget that we were even driving? And
how did I get here? Yeah, how did I even get here?
Yeah, and we had the holiday over the weekend, so I was thinking a lot about this in terms of just soaking in that time with my children and family and not thinking about what's to come on Monday morning. But you get pulled into that. Oh, I have to prep for this. And then you're working, you're not even in the office. Right? You're at home enjoying the best part of your life in which you enjoy the most, and yet you're not even present.
Well, and it's important to keep in mind if we're promoting this eudaimonic sense of happiness, so empowering the individual to seize their own happiness, that quest for happiness, being very intentional about the lives we live is essential. So living in the moment, but even because again, I don't want to shun the past or the future. We need all three. It's a very holistic approach. So there's a real value to reflecting upon the memories, our positive memories, and it actually, in a way, becomes a new experience each time you're remembering it, because there are new and different things happening in your environment as you're pulling that memory back. And of course, our memories are never 100% accurate. So we're always either embellishing them or maybe declining a little bit their importance when it comes to the feeling of happiness. But when we think about eudaimonic happiness, living the full and flourishing life, it requires living a meaningful life. It requires being very intentional about the choices we make in our life. An exercise that I encourage my students who take my happiness seminar to do is to start with getting a gauge for what they're living right now, how they're living, how they're spending their time. And it can be as easy as setting up our own pie chart. We showed this pie chart, but we can set up our own pie chart or a bar graph that just logs how much time do you spend sleeping, how much time do you spend household chores, how much time do you spend studying if you're a student, reading, social media, checking your phone, and you just log it. You don't change anything yet, but for roughly about a week, just log how you're spending your time.
To become aware.
It's a snapshot, yes, of how we're living right now, because the first step is always awareness. Know thyself, as Socrates says. And then sit down and really reflect upon what makes you happy. When were you at your happiest pinnacles? Which types of things, activities, events do you enjoy doing? If you could just map out your ideal life, what would it look like? And then draw a pie chart of that. How much time would you be spending with each of those activities? Keeping in mind, it's not all fantasy land.
Right.
There's certain things you need to do to be able to
go to the
get.
grocery store.
Got to go to the grocery store if I enjoy eating.
Yeah.
If I enjoy taking lavish trips and I'm not independently wealthy, I have to go to work.
We have to do the laundry if we want clean clothes.
There you
but
go.
Even those mundane tasks, I think if you bring a different perspective to it and you live presently, I think they can be more enjoyable. At least for me, that's been my experience. Yeah.
Absolutely. What it means, why you're doing it, and some of it may be goal-oriented. I'm doing this because as I'm earning this money, I'm going to get to do the thing I want, as long as it's not too far out. But some of it can be right in the moment, too. I can remember when things changed for me in doing laundry, very simple thing. But I used to see it as a necessary task, not something I necessarily enjoyed doing, but it's just this essential task to do.
Yeah.
And then I realized one day, it's like what this really is taking care of my children. It's maybe their favorite outfit that I continue, to see passing through probably more than the other outfits.
A manifestation of care.
Yes,
right?
And suddenly the activity felt different.
Yes,
than it had before.
About who you do the activity with. Right, so when I'm cooking dinner, I like to have my children around and
we do too. We're a cooking family.
And then it's an experience. It's not just
Exactly.
I'm jumping through this hoop, checking off this task. I got to get it done. It's I'm living presently in this moment. I'm enjoying it because of the people who I'm surrounding myself with, and we laugh and we,
And if what you enjoy spending time with your family, you've just found more ways to spend time with your family without it being a task or work.
Yeah.
So I see we're almost out of time already. So to wrap this up, I guess our lesson for today, if we're thinking about the question of is happiness a choice, the answer seems to be yes, it is. Doesn't mean that we are necessarily absolutely free to choose whatever we want to choose, but we are definitely free in the attitudes, the reactions, how we spend our time throughout the day, and our mindset in how we're spending our time. So I guess the lesson for today is to live a full and intentionally meaningful life, and with a better chance of being happy.